Step closer to the world of the Viking raiders, not the battles, not the longships, but the secrets whispered behind closed doors. Their sexual practices were as shocking as their raids, mixing ritual dominance and desire in ways that unsettled even their own people. Forget the tidy versions told in school. Viking chiefs took multiple partners, slaves were forced into dark unions, and fertility rites blurred the line between religion and intimacy. To them, sex was not only pleasure, but power, a weapon to control, to humiliate, and sometimes even to worship. This is the side of the Northmen that history books often gloss over. But once you see it, you'll never think of Vikings the same way again. Comment. The time you're watching this, I love seeing. When my time travelers join in, and if raw untold history excites you, subscribing is your choice, but the wildest truths are still ahead. The fire crackles, and the air smells of roasted meat so heavy it clings to your clothes. You don't sit politely at this feast. You stumble, pushed and pulled by bodies warmed with ale mead, and an enthusiasm that teeters between celebration and chaos. Imagine a wedding reception, where the music is just drums and chants. The wine is replaced by hornfuls of mead, and nobody has invented the idea of personal space. That's where you find yourself in the middle of a Viking feast, where drunken laughter slides into something more primal. Pagan rituals weren't held in quiet temples with candles. They were lived out under smoky rafters, flames licking the night sky, and a crowd willing to blur every line of decency if it meant pleasing their gods. You notice how quickly the rhythm of the evening turns. One moment, a toast to Odin or Freyr is raised with solemn pride, and the next men and women are pressed close in displays that mix devotion with indulgence. These weren't quaint gatherings to remind everyone to behave, they were spectacles where behavior itself was thrown into the fire. A historian might call it ritualized fertility performance, but standing here, you'd probably call it a party spiraling into something you weren't warned about. And isn't that the way of history? The words soften in textbooks, but the reality would have left you wide-eyed. Now, if you think modern festivals can get wild, say a music concert where a crowd loses itself in sound and sweat, imagine the same energy, but multiplied by belief that your antics directly affect the harvest. You aren't just partying for fun. You're told the crops depend on your willingness to join in. Talk about peer pressure. The Vikings carried a worldview where fertility of the land livestock and people all intertwine, so a night of unrestrained ritual wasn't embarrassment, it was insurance. You might laugh at the absurdity, but you'd also glance nervously at the nearest elder to see if you're participating enough. The sagas don't shy away from hinting at these moments either. Archaeologists have found feasting halls with benches large enough to hold dozens of people pressed shoulder to shoulder, with animal bones scattered in quantities that suggest meals were only the beginning. Writers like Adam of Bremen, a medieval chronicler, described shocking rites in Uppsala, where animals, and disturbingly, sometimes humans, were sacrificed, followed by what he only labeled acts too shameful to describe, which is an old historian's polite way of saying, "You wouldn't believe what I saw." That reluctance tells you more than if he'd written every detail. So what did it feel like for a Viking raider back home, flush with plunder, sitting down at such a feast? Picture a warrior who survived storms at sea and blood on foreign shores, now back in his hall. The meat is poured, the skald sings of his bravery, and the ritual begins. It's not just food or song, it's a communal intoxication. The old gods demand celebration, and celebration slides quickly into indulgence. If you hesitate, if you wonder whether this is really divine service, or just excuse for chaos, you'd quickly be reminded that nobody questions tradition. Not if they value reputation. You might wonder, did everyone actually join? Or were some simply watching, perhaps frowning into their cups of ale? That's the part history leaves blurry. But remember, these were tight-knit communities, where gossip spread faster than fire on dry thatch. Imagine living in a world where tomorrow your neighbor whispers, "He didn't dance enough for Freyr." Maybe that's why the goats are barren. You'd rather make a fool of yourself than risk that accusation. And this is where the contrast with today feels sharp. Modern rituals of community birthday parties, football matches, even karaoke nights come with boundaries. The Vikings, their gatherings carried the weight of cosmic responsibility. Every laugh, every reckless act under the mead hall roof became a prayer for survival. To outsiders like the Christian monks, who later recorded them, it looked like madness. To insiders, it was sacred duty. Which version would you believe if you were sitting at that fire? Not every story paints these rituals in horror, though. Some sagas treat them with a wink, as if even Viking authors knew their ancestors could overdo things. Like modern comedians joking about relatives at weddings, the old tales admit that when enough mead flowed, dignity took the first longship out of the hall. That mix of humor and unease survives in the sources, and you can feel it when you picture the flickering firelight, the pounding drums, and the way belief in gods gave cover to every excess. And as the night grows thick with smoke and noise, you realize this isn't the end of the journey, it's the beginning. Because once the feasting is over, and the raiders sail out again, the echoes of these rituals carry with them. What they practiced in laughter and fire at home, they sought to impose abroad. The morning after a feast like that, when the fire burns low and the mead horns lie tipped over in the dirt, you notice what nobody likes to talk about: the women missing from their own homes. Viking raiders didn't just carry back silver silk and spices, they carried back people. To call it captured brides almost dresses it up too nicely, like a strange fairy tale. But the reality was raw. On raids across the coasts of Ireland, Scotland, and even deeper into Frankish lands, women were taken as trophies. The sagas mention them with an uncomfortable casualness, as if such acts were part of the natural order, a reward for successful raiding. Stand for a moment in that coastal village as the longships appear. The men know the drill: grab what you can carry and hope you survive. But the women, they become prizes. In some accounts, daughters of chieftains or abbesses of monasteries were singled out, their value magnified not just by beauty, but by the prestige they carried. When a raider seized a woman of noble blood, he wasn't just adding to his household, he was elevating his status in the eyes of his peers. Can you imagine how chilling it would feel knowing your worth was calculated like coin? Take, for example, the chronicles of the Anglo-Saxons. They note monasteries sacked nuns abducted, and settlements stripped of women as effectively as livestock. These weren't isolated events. The trade routes of Dublin and York thrived on this very practice, transforming captives into what the sagas call bondmaids, who might be married, sold, or forced into concubinage. When you think about how central these captives were, you realize Viking raids weren't random outbursts of violence. They were in many ways shopping trips where human beings were items on the list. And yet here's where irony creeps in. The same sagas that celebrate warrior bravery sometimes slip into poetry about the women taken, describing them not as victims, but as honored companions brought back across the sea. It's a storytelling trick, turning the horror of abduction into a tale of romance. Doesn't that sound familiar? Even today, films and books sometimes glamorize what in reality was trauma. It's easier to soften the edges when you're telling stories around the fire than admit the cruelty at the heart of it. One figure who embodies this paradox is Melkorka, an Irish princess mentioned in the Icelandic Laxdæla saga. She's taken by a raider, sold as a concubine, and yet her story is told with admiration because she mothers a famous lineage in Iceland. Her abduction is rewritten as destiny. From her perspective, though, can you imagine the terror of being dragged from your homeland, silenced, and forced into a foreign household? What the saga frames as noble ancestry is at its root the product of capture. Modern parallels sneak into your thoughts, whether you want them or not. Imagine a headline today: "Foreign fighters storm town, abduct women for marriage." You wouldn't romanticize it, you'd call it what it is. But in the Viking Age, the line between crime and custom was drawn in sea foam. To them, seizing a bride was proof of power, a way to ensure your children carried the blood of conquered lands. It was conquest written not just in stone, but in family trees. And what about the women left behind? The sagas are quieter on that. Mothers who watched daughters vanish into the fog, sisters who never saw kin again. These voices are barely whispers in the sources. But their silence speaks volumes, because for every captured bride whose name survives in saga poetry, countless others were erased entirely, absorbed into new households where their past identities mattered less than the children they bore. So when you picture the spoils of a Viking raid, don't just think of silver bracelets or carved ivory. Think of the faces pressed against ship railings, staring back at fading shores' lives forever split in two. These women were as much trophies as any golden cup, and to the raiders, perhaps more so. After all, treasure could be spent and lost. A bride carried status that lasted for generations, and that legacy lingers. When you walk through medieval genealogies and stumble on sudden Irish, Scottish, or Frankish names appearing in Norse lines, you're not seeing a love story. You're seeing the quiet record of capture. You would think a captured bride might at least have the freedom to choose her future once the raid was over, but that would be expecting too much from Viking society. What often followed was the strange and unsettling world of forced marriages. Imagine sitting at a smoky hall table, the same one where feasts once turned wild, and watching negotiations unfold over your future like haggling at a market stall. The Viking Age saw marriage less as romance and more as alliance, a transaction where dowries and land mattered more than feelings. To be blunt, your heart had very little to do with it. It is easy to picture the scene, the chieftain at the head of the table, his voice steady, as he declares what he expects in return for his daughter's hand. Across from him, another man, perhaps a neighboring leader or a raider, fresh from conquest, offers cattle, silver, or even the promise of military support. The daughter in question, she's often silent, her life turning on the outcome of this deal. Do you ever stop to wonder how terrifying it would feel to know your body and future could be weighed against a pile of coins or the promise of an alliance? The sagas don't shy away from these details. In Njal's saga, marriages are negotiated with all the coldness of treaty-making. One woman, Hallgerd, is passed between men not because of love, but because her connections make her valuable in disputes. Even the term bride price tells you everything. It reduces a union to a ledger entry. Modern weddings might stress about catering costs or guest lists. Viking weddings were closer to business mergers, sealed with a feast. Forced marriage also had a darker role in war. Sometimes it wasn't just about alliances within Viking society, but about cementing dominance over conquered people. After raids, leaders would marry local women, willing or not, as a public display that their authority now stretched over the defeated. Think of it as political theater, where the union was both a symbol and a tool of control. A woman might be paraded not as a cherished wife, but as proof that her community had been subdued. Consider how this compares with modern arranged marriages. Even today, in some parts of the world, family decisions carry heavy weight, but at least the veneer of consent exists. In the Viking Age, consent was barely a shadow on the wall. A father or guardian held full authority, and if you happened to be a captured woman, you didn't even have that faint protection. The marriage was simply another stage of captivity, cloaked in ritual and song to make it palatable to the community. There are also stories of women resisting, though these are rare. In one tale, a woman named Otter, brought to Iceland from the British Isles, managed to carve out respect through her cleverness, eventually rising in status despite her forced beginnings. Her story reminds you that not every union ended in silence. Some women found ways to navigate the harsh rules, bending them ever so slightly to carve space for themselves. But such examples stand out precisely because they were exceptions. What's striking is how normalized this all was. If you grew up in that society, you wouldn't question it any more than you question why you sign a marriage certificate today. That doesn't make it less disturbing, it makes it more so. Because when cruelty hides inside tradition, it stops looking cruel to the people living it. Isn't that a chilling thought? How many practices in our own time might one day be judged the same way? You can almost hear the laughter and chatter during a Viking wedding feast, as if nothing unusual had happened. Guests ate roasted boar scalds, sang heroic verses, and the bride sat quietly, her life transformed, without her say. The firelight flickered on smiling faces, none of them troubled by the absence of choice. For them, this was order. For the bride, it was captivity, wrapped in flowers and song. And so, when the sagas boast of noble lineages born from such unions, remember the unseen side of the story. For every proud genealogy etched into history, there was a woman whose fate was decided over a table she could not leave. You walk into a Viking longhouse and immediately sense the imbalance. Too many voices, too many rival glances, too many women bound under the roof of a single man. One wife sharpens her tongue as keenly as her knife. Another tends the hearth with a tight smile, and a concubine slips past. Silently eyes lowered, but ears open. The children weaving between them carry mixed features, each face a reminder that this household is less a family and more a living chessboard. Polyamory and concubinage were not side notes in Viking life. They were banners of prestige, visible proof that a man's reach extended beyond the battlefield. For the powerful, more partners meant more than affection. It was a declaration. A man with a single wife was respectable. A man with multiple women was untouchable. Kings like Harold Fairhair are remembered as much for their web of unions as for their conquests. Each wife tethered him to another clan, each concubine a symbol of victory. Imagine stacking wedding rings, the way you stack trophies, glittering evidence of alliances secured through bodies, not treaties. Doesn't that make you wonder what it felt like to live in a house where every smile concealed calculation, and this wasn't hidden? Viking halls didn't whisper about such arrangements. They paraded them. Feasts brought wives and concubines together seated in rows where rivalry simmered just beneath the surface. The sagas delight in recounting these tensions with famous episodes like the verbal sparring of Hallgerd and Bergthora in Njal's saga. What began as sharp words at a feast spiraled into feuds that pulled entire families into bloodshed. Domestic disputes weren't just gossip fodder, they were sparks that lit wars. Concubines, of course, often had no choice. Many were captives from raids folded into households, not as wives, but as secondary partners. Their presence carried a different kind of weight. They reminded everyone at the Feast of Victories won abroad. To a Viking raider, bringing home a concubine was a badge of honor. To the concubine herself, it was survival cloaked in ceremony. Yet their children could still inherit, which fueled rivalries sharper than any sword. Wives schemed to protect their children's claims, concubines maneuvered quietly to lift theirs, and men sat at the center, basking in the chaos they'd created. If this feels unfamiliar, think again. Modern society may not allow multiple wives under one roof, but the competitive dynamics echo in subtler ways. Consider the quiet rivalry of social media, whose photos get praised, whose lifestyle seems more admired, whose children shine brighter in curated snapshots. The Longhouse didn't have screens, but it had benches, jewelry, and gossip. Status games have never gone away. They've only changed costumes. The reality, though, is that such arrangements worked because they reinforced power. A chaotic household wasn't a weakness, it was proof of abundance. To outsiders, the noise of many women and children meant prosperity. To insiders, it meant sleepless nights, tense feasts, and endless battles fought without weapons. How strange, isn't it, that the very chaos which gnawed at the foundations of a family was celebrated as a sign of strength? And so, when sagas praise the great lineages born of these tangled unions, you can almost see the flicker of firelight on tense faces. The Longhouse was more than shelter. It was a stage where loyalty and envy lived side by side. Every child represented both hope and threat. Every wife or concubine, a living alliance or rivalry. In that sense, the Viking household was its own battlefield, no less dangerous than the seas their men crossed. And yet, if crowded households and rival concubines weren't complicated enough, the whispers that crept through the sagas pointed to something even more unsettling: unions, drawn dangerously close within the family itself. You catch a murmur in the corner of a hall, hushed words passed between two old men who lean close to avoid curious ears. They speak not of raids or treasure, but of kinships twisted too tightly, of marriages within families that raise uneasy questions. Incest, though rarely admitted outright, lingers as a shadow in Viking sagas, a subject hinted at more than confessed. In a society obsessed with lineage and inheritance, the temptation to keep bloodlines pure sometimes crossed into territory that even contemporaries found unsettling. Picture a chieftain desperate to secure his legacy. His wealth and power cannot scatter into rival clans, so he arranges unions that keep property inside the family. Cousins wed half-siblings, whispered about in saga margins. These tales are not splashed across sources with the openness of feasting or raiding, but the absence of clarity is almost as telling. When authors write carefully around a subject, you can sense their discomfort. Isn't it curious how silence often reveals more than speech? One saga that brushes this line is the story of Sigurd the Mighty of Orkney, whose descendants tangled in webs of family unions so close they almost fold in on themselves. The genealogies make you squint, wondering whether chroniclers skipped a detail out of embarrassment. Even in the wider Norse world, hints arise like the saga of the Volsungs, where siblings Sigmund and Signy conceive a son destined for vengeance. Though wrapped in myth, the very inclusion of such a theme suggests a cultural awareness that taboo boundaries could and sometimes did blur. If you step back, the logic becomes grimly practical. Land was precious in Scandinavia, inheritance was everything, and diluting family holdings by marrying too far afield could be ruinous. The solution: marry closer to home, sometimes too close for comfort. What strikes you is not that it happened many ancient societies faced the same temptation, but that the Vikings carried both pride in lineage and unease in its extremes. Their sagas show admiration for great family trees, while leaving dark patches where the branches twist together too tightly. How do you compare that to the modern world? Perhaps think of corporations guarded so fiercely that leadership passes only within a family, no matter how questionable the choice. The goal isn't always efficiency, it's control. In the Viking Age, the household was the corporation, and bloodlines were the boardroom politics. You might raise your eyebrow at a CEO appointing an unqualified relative today. Imagine your whole community raising their eyebrows at your chieftain marrying his niece. The awkwardness isn't new. It's just packaged differently across centuries. It's worth asking, how did ordinary people react? Did they whisper disapproval? Or did they simply shrug? Knowing power has always bent rules. The sources don't answer, but the very fact that sagas preserve rumors suggests the discomfort was real. After all, if nobody cared, why would the storytellers tread so cautiously? Sometimes the strongest condemnation lies not in fiery words, but in the decision to murmur rather than shout. These rumors also remind you that Viking society, for all its boldness in war and feasts, lived under the same human frailties as any other. Ambition, fear of loss, desire to control it all, pushed people toward choices that today would be unthinkable. And when you read between the lines of sagas and genealogies, you feel the tension of a culture proud of its strength, but haunted by the compromises it made to preserve it. The whispers of family secrets fading into something stranger, still the sound of drums echoing outside, pulling the crowd into the night. You follow, and there, among the flickering torches, you see an odd procession: men leading animals decorated with garlands, women scattering grain, and a priestly figure raising his arms as though calling on forces beyond the sky. This is no ordinary festival. These are fertility rites, where human desire was bound up with the cycles of livestock and harvest, and where rituals you might laugh at today carried the weight of survival back then. The Norse pantheon placed fertility gods like Freyr at the center of these ceremonies. Freyr, often depicted with symbols of virility and prosperity, demanded more than prayers, he demanded enactments. The logic was simple: if humans performed the acts of fertility in exaggerated theatrical ways, then nature itself would echo the performance, ensuring fields sprouted, herds multiplied, and families flourished. It wasn't entertainment, it was magic disguised as theater. And you have to admit, there's a certain absurd charm in imagining farmers convinced the success of their crops depended on how convincingly their neighbors mimed passion at a bonfire. Ancient chroniclers, like Adam of Bremen, peering into these ceremonies with Christian unease, reported scenes at Uppsala that blurred the line between devotion and shock. He wrote carefully, hinting at displays too indecent for his pen. When a medieval author says I cannot describe what I saw. You can bet it was far more outrageous than the sanitized words allow. It leaves you wondering, were these rituals genuine belief, playful community theater, or both at once? Look closer at the animals in the procession. Horses especially played a part. Archaeological finds suggest horses were not only sacrificed in rituals, but sometimes central to fertility ceremonies. To ride or handle the horse in a certain way became a symbolic act of communion with divine forces. In some sagas, hints remain of practices where rulers demonstrated dominance over a sacred horse to prove their right to lead. To our modern ears, this sounds bizarre, even unsettling, but to them, it was the visible proof that their leader embodied fertility and strength. Can you imagine electing leaders today by asking them to perform symbolic acts with farm animals? Democracy suddenly seems refreshingly simple, and yet the seriousness of it cannot be overstated. These were not private games, but communal obligations. Refusal to participate could mark you as suspicious, even dangerous, as if you were hoarding bad luck. That social pressure must have been immense. If the crops failed, if the goats gave birth to too few kids, who would the community blame? Perhaps the person who frowned during the fertility dance. When survival rests on soil and herd belief fuses with fear, and fear demands ritual, the sagas themselves sometimes wink at the absurdity. In the tale of Hrafnkel, for example, devotion to a sacred horse forms the backbone of a man's reputation. When the horse dies, his fortune collapses almost as if the community truly believed his bond with that animal carried their destiny. Think of it like the mascot of a modern sports team. Except imagine the entire city believing the corn harvest depended on how well the mascot was treated. Suddenly, it doesn't sound so funny anymore, does it? And while today you might chuckle at the idea of acting out fertility for the sake of wheat, remember that these rites wove communities together. Everyone from children to elders knew their roles. The performances became collective expressions of hope, fear, and desperation. They weren't simply strange Viking practices, they were survival strategies written in ritual. So, as the drums pound and the torches blaze, you see a crowd caught between laughter and reverence, embarrassment and necessity. Pagan fire feasts had blurred intimacy and devotion. Captured brides had turned conquest into lineage. Forced marriages had bound alliances, and tangled households had made chaos into prestige. But here in the fertility rites with animals and grain, you glimpse something deeper, a culture that could turn even the awkward into the sacred because their very lives depended on believing it worked. The smell of smoke still hangs in the air when you notice another figure at the edge of the ritual, not a warrior or a farmer, but a thrall, a slave. His back is bent, his eyes lowered, and you suddenly realize the true machinery that kept Viking society turning wasn't only swords and ships. It was people owned as property. Thralls were everywhere in fields, in workshops, and longhouses. And yes, they were also in the most private corners of Viking households, used and abused in ways that the sagas barely whisper, yet history confirms. If you thought captured brides were unsettling, the life of a thrall was worse, for they had no chance to rise into the status of wife or partner. They were tools, and often treated as such. Slavery wasn't a sideline of Viking life, it was central. Every raid across the Irish coast, every attack on a Frankish village wasn't just about plunder. It was about capturing human beings to sell or keep. The bustling slave markets of Dublin, Hedeby, and York thrived because Viking longships delivered steady human cargo. Imagine a medieval auction block where young women fetched higher prices, their fates sealed not by choice, but by the highest bidder. Doesn't it give you a shiver to think of survival reduced to a transaction in silver coins? Inside Viking households, thralls served every function. Some chopped wood, others tended livestock, but many women were forced into more intimate roles. Chroniclers speak cautiously, using terms like bondmaids. But the reality was clear enough. These women were folded into households not as concubines with a sliver of status, but as slaves whose bodies were demanded without ceremony. Archaeological evidence even shows disproportionate numbers of women among captured populations, confirming that raiders targeted them deliberately. Survival, for a thrall, wasn't about climbing in status, it was about enduring. One of the most chilling accounts comes from the Arab traveler Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who witnessed a Norse funeral along the Volga River. He describes how a female slave chosen to accompany her dead master was forced into acts of ritual intimacy before being killed to join him in the afterlife. Ibn Fadlan wrote with shock, and his words still chill the spine centuries later. You cannot help but think to the Norse onlookers, this was tradition. To the thrall, it was a nightmare wrapped in ritual. And yet sagas rarely pause to sympathize with thralls. Their stories are mentioned only in passing, as if their suffering was background noise to the exploits of free men and women. The silence is deafening. Consider how modern history often glosses over the enslaved voices in favor of kings and queens. How many times do textbooks skim across the labor that built empires? The Viking Age is no different. Their glory sits on a foundation of human suffering that rarely makes it into heroic verses. Still, a few tales slip through the cracks. The Laxdæla saga tells of Melkorka, an Irish princess enslaved and sold as a concubine in Iceland. Though technically a thrall, her cleverness and quiet resilience eventually earned her respect, and her son became a notable figure. But even her success began with chains. For every Melkorka remembered countless nameless women, vanished into households, and were forgotten. Doesn't that make you pause to think of how much history is simply missing lost with those whose lives were never deemed worth writing down? If you draw a comparison to the modern world, think of how invisible labor often is. Migrant workers who clean skyscrapers at night, employees in factories producing cheap goods, far from consumer eyes, society still hides its dependence on those at the bottom. The Vikings were no different. They just wore their dependence more openly, calling it by its true name, slavery. So as you watch the thralls fade back into the shadows of the longhouse, you feel the weight of their silence. These were not minor figures in Viking society. They were the backbone. And in the most shocking, cruel ways, they were also pulled into the intimate lives of their masters. When you think of Viking strength ships and glory, remember the unseen thousands whose lives were consumed to make it possible. The longhouse air shifts from the heavy silence of thralls to a different kind of tension mockery, sharp and biting. A man steps into the ritual space wearing garments meant for women, and the reaction is immediate. Some jeer, some whisper, others smirk behind their cups of ale. In a society where masculinity was measured by the clang of steel and the steadiness of a sheet wall, nothing was more dangerous than being called arger, unmanly. And yet paradoxically, such role reversals kept appearing in Viking rituals, half condemned and half required. Much of this came through cider, the magical practice tied to prophecy and fate weaving. Freya, The goddess of love and fertility was said to have taught it, and Odin himself was known to wield its power. But for a man to perform Seder, he often had to cross the line into feminine roles, whether through dress, voice, or mannerisms. Chroniclers couldn't resist highlighting the contradiction, the most powerful god dabbling in woman's magic. How strange is it that ridicule and reverence could cling to the same act in the saga's insults fly with sharp precision. To accuse a rival of cross-dressing or practicing Seder was to attack his honor at its core. Duels were fought over less. But in the same breath, those very accusations acknowledged the effectiveness of such magic. After all, if it were powerless, why would warriors lose their tempers at the mere suggestion? Doesn't that sound familiar? How people lash out most fiercely at the things they secretly fear or respect. Historical sources reinforce this tension. The Ynglinga saga labels Seder unmanly, even shameful, yet refuses to erase Odin's use of it. The text leaves the contradiction unresolved, dangling before the reader like bait. That dangling silence speaks volumes. It suggests that Norse society lived with an uncomfortable truth. Gender lines were firm in theory, but blurred when ritual demanded it. Try to picture it. The firelight flickers, drums beat in rhythm, and a man dressed in women's clothing begins the incantation. Some in the crowd scoff, others avert their eyes, yet none dare interrupt. For all their mockery, they still believe the performance has weight. If the harvest fails, or the prophecy falters, who would shoulder the blame? Better to endure discomfort than risk angering the unseen powers. Comparisons to the modern world are easy to find. Think of how societies today often sneer at what challenges traditional roles, even while borrowing from it in private or depending on it in subtle ways. The Vikings weren't unique in this contradiction. They simply expressed it in rituals so visible that everyone had to confront it. The sagas also reveal how personal these accusations could become. Warriors hurled charges of unmanliness as if they were weapons, yet beneath the insult lay the grudging admission that such practices worked. A curse only stings if people believe it. And when sagas show heroes red-faced at such slurs, you sense the truth. The Vikings feared not just ridicule, but the uncanny power bound up in those mocked acts. What lingers most isn't the image of a man ridiculed in a gown, but the society caught in its own snare, desperate to enforce rigid norms, while knowing their rituals needed those very breaches. It's an uncomfortable reminder that cultures often survive on the contradictions they publicly deny. By now, you might think Viking life had exhausted its shocks, captured brides, tangled households, whispered taboos, and even men mocked for bending gender lines. But then you step outside into the pale daylight of midsummer and see something that feels both festive and unsettling: games of fertility played out in public. Picture a field alive with laughter drums pounding and contests where strength and virility are on open display. These weren't quaint village games. They were rituals woven with meaning, where boasting about one's prowess became a communal spectacle. The sagas mention gatherings called Thing, where politics and play mingled. After settling disputes, people often turned to contests, wrestling, horse fights, or feats of endurance. But tucked among these were games laced with fertility symbolism. Men boasted of their conquests, not just in battle, but in the bedchamber, turning private matters into public performance. To Vikings, virility wasn't something hidden. It was a quality celebrated as openly as a fine sword. Imagine, if you will, a modern sporting event where victory speeches included claims about personal passion. It would draw nervous chuckles today. but in Viking fields, it drew nods of approval. Take, for instance, the boast poems, or NID verses, where rivals insulted each other with accusations of weakness or impotence. These were not jokes to shrug off. They could spark feuds as deadly as land disputes. Public accusations about one's ability to satisfy a wife or produce heirs were taken with lethal seriousness. Doesn't it strike you how fragile honor can be when words alone could push warriors into bloodshed? There's even archaeological evidence suggesting fertility contests took ritualized form. Carvings on stones depict phallic symbols, while artifacts linked to Freyr suggest his cult encouraged explicit displays as part of agricultural ceremonies. If crops needed encouragement, then so did men, and public demonstrations of virility were folded into seasonal celebrations. Think of it as a community pep talk, except the focus wasn't winning a game, but ensuring life itself would continue. Yet humor colored these contests as much as solemnity. Saga writers often record witty exchanges, turning insults into entertainment. At feasts, men might challenge each other with bawdy verses, their laughter echoing while women watched with raised brows. The line between ritual seriousness and rowdy humor blurred as if everyone knew the jokes carried hidden weight. Have you ever noticed how humor often masks anxiety? The Vikings were no exception. They laughed, but beneath the laughter was the gnawing fear of failed harvests, childless marriages, and fading bloodlines. These contests also reinforced hierarchy. The strongest man, the most boastful poet the father, with the most children they all gained standing in the eyes of the community. Public fertility games became another arena to prove dominance just as vital as raiding abroad or feasting at home. If you couldn't win at war, perhaps you could win in song or in demonstrating your virility. In every case, the goal was the same: to stand taller than your rivals. Now compare this to today. We still stage contests of masculinity, sports championships, strength competitions, even the subtle boasting of careers and wealth. The themes remain the same: who is strongest, who is most capable, who carries the legacy forward. The Vikings simply stripped away the subtlety and performed these truths in the open. As you watch the crowd cheer, you sense the layered meaning. On the surface, it's entertainment. Beneath, it's insurance against famine and failure. Every laugh, every boast, every contest of strength becomes a ritual plea to the gods: let us endure another year. It's messy, noisy, and awkward, but to the people gathered here, it is necessary. So the games go on: laughter and anxiety twined together, each boast carrying the weight of survival. In their rowdy contests, you see a society that turned even its deepest fears into festivals, convinced that by making fertility a public game, they could coax fate to stay on their side. The laughter from the games fades, and for the first time, you hear a different sound rising across the north: the tolling of church bells. By the late Viking Age, Christianity had arrived with priests carrying books instead of swords, and what they saw left them horrified. The feasts drenched in mead, the captured brides treated as trophies, the forced marriages arranged like cattle trades, the concubines and thralls folded into households, the whispers of incest, the fertility rites with horses and bonfires, the cross-dressing rituals, the public boasts of virility. Every practice that had been normal in Norse eyes became, in the words of Christian observers, abomination. And here is the hook: the culture that had once terrified Europe was about to be reshaped by the very faith it once mocked. Missionaries didn't hold back in their descriptions. Adam of Bremen, writing of Uppsala in the 11th century, shuddered at rituals too shameful to describe condemning them as demonic. English monks recorded raids not only as violence against churches, but as assaults against the very sanctity of marriage and family. The Norse obsession with fertility and status viewed through Christian eyes became evidence of corruption. To them, the shocking acts weren't just foreign, they were proof of sin running unchecked. Yet the shift wasn't immediate. Conversion took centuries, often more political than spiritual. A king might accept baptism, not because he suddenly renounced the old gods, but because the alliance with Christian rulers came with wealth and legitimacy. Think of Olaf Tryggvason, the fiery king who spread Christianity through Norway, sometimes with persuasion, often with force. His reign symbolized crossroads. Cling to the sagas and rituals of old, or step into the new order where church and crown intertwined. The irony is sharp. Many of the same practices the church condemned had once been the glue of Norse survival. Fertility rites weren't decadence, they were desperate pleas for crops. Concubinage wasn't indulgence, it was politics and conquest in human form. Public boasts weren't crude, they were a way of ranking men in a society obsessed with honor. And yet once the Christian lens took hold, these acts were rewritten as shameful sins. Doesn't it make you wonder how much of history is shaped less by what happened and more by who got to write about it? Slowly, the change filtered down. Longhouses gave way to churches. Carved idols were pulled from temples, and sagas were transcribed by Christian scribes who smoothed edges, cut details, or recast them as cautionary tales. The fire-lit rituals vanished, replaced by candlelit altars. The games of fertility transformed into seasonal festivals tied to saints. Even the treatment of women shifted while not free. By modern standards, they gained protections in Christian law against being traded or seized like livestock. Still, the old ways didn't vanish overnight. Archaeological finds reveal crosses buried alongside Thor's hammers, as if people weren't quite ready to choose. Families hedged their bets, whispering prayers to both Christ and Odin. The echoes of shocking Viking practices lived on in folklore, in superstitions, in hushed traditions that lingered long after the priests had declared victory. Change, after all, is never as clean as official records pretend. And here is where you sit, looking back across the 10 parts of this journey. You've walked through smoky halls, stumbled into feasts, where ritual blurred with indulgence, watched captives dragged aboard ships, listened to forced marriages negotiated like treaties, witnessed households tangled with concubines, overheard rumors of kinships. Too close, stood among animal-laden fertility rites, felt the shame of mocked men in women's clothing, and laughed nervously at public games of virility. Now you watch the priests write their condemnations, reshaping memory itself. History, in the end, is never neutral. To the Vikings, these acts were woven into survival. To their enemies, they were monstrous. To later Christians, they were sins begging for redemption. And to you sitting here, centuries later, they are stories shocking strange, sometimes darkly humorous, but always revealing. They remind you that what one age calls normal, another will call scandal. The bonfires dim, the bells grow louder, and the saga of Viking shock gives way to the silence of the church. The mead halls grow quiet, the sagas fade, and suddenly your gaze shifts from the smoky intimacy of rituals to the raw brutality of the raids themselves. Because while the shocking practices of Viking raiders revealed what happened inside their households and feasts, the wider world knew them for something far harsher. The thunder of longships on the horizon, the crash of doors splintered in the night, and the ruthless efficiency of men who lived by the sword. What seemed bizarre in their private rituals becomes terrifying when paired with the merciless way they struck coastal towns, monasteries, and villages. If their feasts blurred sacred and profane, their raids erased any boundary between survival and savagery. The true face of Viking life lay in conquest. The first thing you notice isn't the sound, it's the silence. Birds that were chattering a moment ago fall quiet, as if the entire shoreline holds its breath. Then across the pale water, something slices into view, a line of wooden beasts, their carved dragon heads glaring as if alive. They glide forward so smoothly, you wonder if they're floating on mist. Your stomach knots because you already know what those shapes mean. This isn't trade. This isn't diplomacy. This is a storm of men with shields and axes, and their arrival is the kind of omen no prayer can push away. Villagers nearby stiffen tools still in their hands, goats and sheep forgotten in the fields. It's that frozen instant where you think, maybe if I don't move, maybe if I just keep my head down, they'll turn away. But that's the cruel trick of these raids. Vikings didn't row for days across rough seas just to wave hello. The sails snap open, painted bright against the sky, and the oars strike harder. You can almost feel the rhythm in your own chest, like a drumbeat announcing that your world is about to change. The dragon-prowed ships weren't decoration. They were intimidation, carved into wood, designed to hit you in the gut before the first warrior set foot on land. Imagine being a farmer who's never traveled farther than the next village, and suddenly you're staring at vessels that look like they've sailed straight out of a nightmare. That's how these raiders worked. They didn't just fight bodies, they fought minds. And fear once planted grows faster than fire. A question for you. What would you grab if this happened today? If strangers stormed down your street at dawn, would you run for your car keys, your phone, your family photos? In a Viking raid, there was no luxury of choice. By the time you thought of grabbing anything, the shore was already filled with shouting, splashing, and the gleam of iron. The only real decision was whether to run and hope or to freeze and hope, and neither was much of a strategy. When the first longship grinds against the pebbles, warriors leap off with the kind of energy that feels unfair. They've rowed for hours, yet they look like they're just getting started. Shields slap against their backs, axes gleam in their fists, and their boots sink into the wet sand with confidence. This is their element. They aren't awkward farmers fumbling with tools. They're practiced predators trained to move fast and strike faster. For the people watching from the huts above the beach, it's less like seeing an enemy army and more like seeing a natural disaster. You don't fight a tornado. You just hope it skips your house. Historians often note how often these raids came at dawn. It wasn't luck. Dawn was deliberate. You've been asleep, your guard is down, your body still slow from dreams. Then boots pounding smoke, rising strangers shouting in a tongue that cuts like blades. It's like waking to find your house already on fire, and the fire talks back. That's how disorienting it felt. Monks wrote about it in their chronicles, describing the terror of watching men pour out of ships like shadows made flesh. But the ships don't stop at one. More keels scrape onto the sand. More hulls slide into the shallows. If you've ever been at an airport and watched one plane taxi in after another, you know that strange, sinking feeling of, oh no, there's more. Now picture that, except instead of tired travelers with luggage, it's warriors in helmets pouring out with weapons. One boat might overwhelm a village. 5 or 6 was overkill by design. Overwhelm the eye, overwhelm the spirit, and the rest is easy. That's the cruel beauty of it. The raid begins before the first blow falls. Fear does half the work. The dragon heads on the prows. The sudden silence of the birds. The oars slicing water in unison. It's all a theater of dread. And you standing there on the edge of your own land realize the truth. With a kind of sick clarity, these ships are not strangers passing by. They are monsters risen from the horizon, and they have chosen this place. You can still smell the salt from the sea when the first shouts ripple through the village. At this point, no one needs to ask what's happening. Rumors of raids have been drifting inland for months, carried on the lips of merchants and pilgrims. Some say the raiders stripped entire monasteries. Bare others whisper that they took whole communities away on their ships. So when you hear that sudden barking of voices at the shore, the normal rhythm of life cracks. A woman drops her water jug, clay shattering across the dirt. A shepherd abandons his flock in the meadow. The blacksmith stops mid-swing, hammer frozen above glowing iron. Every ear strains toward the coast, but denial clings stubbornly. Surely they think it can't be here. It's always the other villages, the ones downriver, the ones nearer the trade routes. People convince themselves of safety like it's a charm. And yet gulls wheel overhead, the dogs bark madly, and already the smoke of torches begins to curl upward against the pale morning sky. No one can say they weren't warned. Priests had preached sermons about heathen ships, and kings had promised defenses that never seemed to stretch far enough. The truth is that ordinary people lived in the space between rumor and reality, knowing danger was near, but hoping it would never arrive on their doorstep. You see it in their eyes now. Mothers clutching children, men fumbling for axes they normally use to split wood, not skulls. This is the cruel comedy of raids. The villagers are always farmers, not fighters. Their hands are calloused from plows, not hilts. The bravest grab pitchforks and stand like they mean to defend something. But even they know the odds are absurd. It's a bit like watching someone square up against a professional boxer with nothing but a broom handle. The courage might be admirable, but the outcome isn't in doubt. And then there are the whispers, the one that spread faster than the flames themselves. They're here for the church. They'll take the cattle. They want slaves. Every voice adds to the panic until it becomes a chorus of dread. Villages had no sirens or alarms. Their warning system was word of mouth. And word of mouth is as flawed as it is fast. Some people rush to hide treasures under floorboards. Others sprint into the woods, tripping over roots in their haste. The result is chaos before the first raider even crests the hill. Here's a question. If you lived in a world where danger arrived by sea, would you build your home further inland away from the coast? It seems obvious now, doesn't it? But for medieval communities, the shore was life itself. The sea wasn't just threat. It was food, trade connection. You couldn't simply turn your back on it. so people stayed close even when it made them vulnerable. That's the paradox. The same waves that carried fish and merchants also carried dragon-proud nightmares. Meanwhile, leaders stumble through decisions. Some cry for everyone to gather at the church, trusting stone walls and faith to act as a shield. Others demand scattering into the fields, reasoning that a moving target is harder to catch. Neither choice is truly safe, and that uncertainty eats at every heart. It's the sort of moment where you realize no one's really in charge. The reeve, the priest, the village elder, they all look as frightened as anyone else. Authority collapses in the face of fire. Imagine a medieval map spread out on a table. You'd see small dots for villages clustered along rivers and coasts, each one a bead waiting to be threaded by raiders. That's how the Vikings saw it, not isolated communities, but a string of opportunities. And just as you'd circle a promising shop on a modern shopping trip, they circled monasteries or towns where the gossip promised treasure. The people in those dots didn't realize they were part of someone else's itinerary until the ships were already pulling in. As the commotion builds, the sound becomes unbearable: children crying, livestock, bleating shouts in two languages clashing in the air. Some villagers throw buckets of water on their thatched roofs, trying to prevent fire before it starts. Others run to the church to clutch at relics, as if holy silver might melt fear into courage. You can picture it all: the sudden shift from calm routine to a chaos that smells of sweat, smoke, and terror. And still, at the edge of the village, you catch glimpses of figures moving between houses, shouting in a tongue you don't know. The rumors have solidified into flesh and blood danger. The raids are no longer stories traded around hearths. They are here, and the village is caught in that dreadful moment between preparation and catastrophe, when everyone knows something terrible is coming, but no one knows exactly how it will fall. It happens faster than your mind can fully register. One moment the morning air is filled with scattered shouts and the rustle of panic. The next it's split by the roar of war cries as the first raiders flood into the village. There is no formal declaration, no negotiation, no warning. Horn blown politely in advance. The sudden strike is the very definition of shock. Houses set alight with a torch jabbed into straw. A door kicked down without hesitation, animals bolting in every direction. You barely have time to blink before the ordinary rhythm of life is shredded beyond repair. The speed is what makes it brutal. Viking raids weren't drawn-out sieges with polite standoffs. They were lightning strikes meant to overwhelm before defenders could even muster. Think about how a hawk dives for its prey. The rabbit doesn't even know it's been targeted until talons are already closing in. That's what a raid felt like for these villagers. One heartbeat of relative calm, then chaos crashing down from every direction. And it's not just the sound of fire crackling or livestock scattering. The noise is a full orchestra of terror. Axes smash against doors, wood splintering in sharp bursts. Shields clash as raiders shove into narrow lanes. The guttural syllables of Norse war cries mix with the shrieks of families jolted from their beds. If you've ever been startled awake by a smoke alarm in the middle of the night, you know the disorienting panic. Now, multiply that by an entire village, every house sounding its own alarm, all at once. Some people try to fight back. A handful of men rush forward with pitchforks, axes meant for trees, even kitchen knives. But their movements are clumsy compared to the raiders whose entire lives have been shaped by combat. Imagine a pickup basketball team of amateurs suddenly facing an NBA squad in their prime. That's the gap here. The defenders are brave, yes, but bravery doesn't close the skill gap when one side is drilled in formation, weapon balance, and coordinated strikes. It's not a contest, it's a demonstration. And even those defenders are part of the raiders' plan. The first few clashes are designed to intimidate as much as to kill. A villager steps forward, swings his tool, and the Viking knocks it aside effortlessly before striking back. Others see that one blow, that one collapse, and the fight drains out of them. Terror doesn't have to spread logically, it spreads visually. The fall of one defender is the message to the others: resist, and this is your fate. Meanwhile, flames are licking higher. Thatched roofs are tinderboxes catching with just a spark. Entire homes become torches in minutes, smoke rolling thick enough to sting your eyes and choke your lungs. If you've ever stood too close to a bonfire and felt the searing heat, imagine that multiplied by 10, surrounding you on all sides with no way to step back. The air itself becomes the enemy. Think too about what's being destroyed. This isn't just property. In these homes are heirlooms, tools, seeds for planting written charters or holy texts. Every item torched is a piece of continuity erased, meaning that survival tomorrow will be harder even if today is endured. That's why the sudden strike is so devastating. It doesn't just break bodies, it breaks futures. A raid burns not only the house, but the memory of stability. And you can almost see the psychology of the raiders at work. Strike hard, strike fast, leave no time for organized resistance. While the villagers stumble in shock, the Norsemen move with practiced precision. They know exactly which buildings to hit first: the church, the storehouse, the wealthiest longhouse. It's like watching a heist film where the robbers have rehearsed every step, while the victims are still wondering if this is really happening. The imbalance is almost absurd, and that's what makes it effective. So as dawn fully breaks, the village is already burning. What began as shadows on the horizon has turned into a storm of fire steel and panic. There's no more guessing, no more hoping it might pass you by. The raiders are here, and they've made sure that the very first strike leaves no doubt this place this morning belongs to them. They say the cruelest cut isn't the one on your skin. It's the one on your heart when you watch everything familiar unravel. And that's the hook of this moment. Panic doesn't come politely. It crashes like a wave, pulling people under before they know how to swim. You watch neighbors stumble in terror, not because they're weak, but because no human being is ready for their world to flip upside down in a single breath. Mothers clutch children so tightly that the little ones cry not from the raiders, but from their mother's desperate grip. Old men who once boasted of battles long ago suddenly hobble toward the woods, their pride trailing behind like smoke. It's in these moments you see the raw truth. A raid doesn't just pit warriors against villagers. It pits instinct against instinct. Fight or flight isn't a theory here. It's happening in front of your eyes. A shepherd drops his crook, runs barefoot across stony paths, and doesn't even look back as his flock scatters behind him. A young boy, too slow to keep up, is yanked by the arm, dragged screaming by a raider, who sees not a child, but a commodity. And in that instant, families are broken apart like twigs. The cruelty lies not only in the violence, but in the separation, people torn from each other without even a chance to say goodbye. If you've ever been in a crowd, when panic breaks out, a fire alarm in a theater or a sudden stampede at a sports event, You know how quickly order collapses. Multiply that by 10 and strip away the emergency exits. That's what this feels like. Villagers crash into each other, stumbling over fallen buckets and burning beams, each one convinced they'll be the next to fall. It's chaos without choreography. And for the raiders, it's exactly what they want. Confusion makes capture easy. And capture is the goal. Contrary to the image of endless slaughter, many Viking raids weren't about wiping populations out. Dead villagers don't fetch silver on the slave markets of Dublin or Hedeby. Living ones do. That's why, amid the blood and fire, you notice raiders binding wrists, dragging prisoners toward the shore. Women scream as they're herded together. Children wail as they're torn from their fathers, and men are forced down onto their knees, with blades hovering just close enough to erase any thought of resistance. It's not random cruelty, it's calculated profit. Picture this: a girl no older than 15 clutched by the arm, her mother running behind, only to be shoved to the dirt. A farmer, still clutching the iron key to his grain store, is stripped of both dignity and freedom as ropes cinch around his wrists. In the span of a single morning, generations are divided, homes emptied not only of goods, but of the very people who gave them meaning. And all the while, the ships wait at the water's edge like hungry mouths ready to swallow the village whole. The most heartbreaking part is the silence after each snatch. When someone is dragged away, the rest of the family often freezes, powerless to intervene. You'd think the air would be filled with more fighting, but no terror suffocates action. It's the same silence you might feel when watching a thief snatch a purse in a crowded subway car. Everyone sees it, but no one moves, afraid they'll be next. Multiply that paralysis by the threat of steel, and you understand why so many stood still, watching helplessly as their loved ones vanished. One chronicler in Francia once wrote of these raids, describing the cries of mothers louder than the church bells, and you realize that even the monks, usually concerned only with their relics, notice the raw human suffering of capture. Bells could be rebuilt, chalices replaced, but stolen lives left a wound that no carpenter or mason could fix. So when the raiders corral their captives and march them toward the shore, the scene is already bigger than a single attack. It's the unraveling of a community's fabric. Homes can be rebuilt, but families torn apart leave scars that linger for generations. The village has gone from whispers of danger to the blunt, undeniable truth. It isn't just their goods being stolen today, it's their people. The defenders don't wait to be invited. A few men clutching whatever they can turn into a weapon, step forward into the smoke-choked lanes. Some carry spears passed down from fathers long dead, their tips rusted with years of neglect. Others brandish axes meant for splitting logs, not skulls. A blacksmith wipes soot from his eyes, gripping a hammer heavy enough to dent armor, though he's used it mostly on stubborn iron. And though their hearts thud with courage, it's like watching townsfolk march into a storm with umbrellas, symbolic gestures that don't change the force of what's coming. Because here they come, the raiders' shields up, blades swinging with practiced ease. Their formation is loose but purposeful, each man knowing exactly how to cover the next. You can hear the clash before you see it, iron striking wood, the thud of shields colliding, the hiss of blades slicing air. Villagers rush forward shouting prayers and curses, but their lines buckle almost instantly. When a farmer swings wildly with his pitchfork, a raider sidesteps, hooks the handle with his axe, and wrenches it away like he's done it 100 times. That's the brutal difference. One side fights with desperation, the other with muscle memory. Think of it like a neighborhood soccer team suddenly thrust into the World Cup. They know the rules they've played on weekends, but the pros across from them have lived and breathed this game every day of their lives. No matter how much heart the amateurs pour in, skill and training dictate the outcome. The villagers are outclassed before the fight even begins. Still, resistance isn't meaningless. Every swing, every defiant shout buys seconds for a child to scramble under a cart, for an elder to limp toward the woods, for a mother to shove her baby into a stranger's arms and scream, "Run." You might wonder why resist at all when defeat seems guaranteed. But that's the strange thing about human beings. Sometimes it isn't about winning. It's about not surrendering completely, about leaving behind a flicker of dignity even in loss. The Raiders know this too. That's why their first clashes are brutal, designed to crush morale as quickly as possible. One strike drops a man where he stands, and suddenly 3 others retreat. Fear is more efficient than blood. The spectacle of defeat spreads faster than fire, convincing others that resistance is hopeless. And soon the defenders who remain are fewer, their movements slower, their courage faltering like a candle in wind. Now imagine standing in the middle of this, smoke blurring your vision, screams echoing from every direction. Your senses can't keep up 1 second. You hear the metallic ring of weapons. The next, you smell burning thatch. The next, you feel the ground shake under pounding boots. Panic pulls you in every direction, yet your body freezes, unable to decide whether to run or fight. That's the true cruelty of these moments. You don't have time to think, only to react, and often the reaction is too late. Some chronicles from Anglo-Saxon England describe defenders praying aloud even as they charged, hoping God might grant them a miracle. Picture that men rushing into certain defeat, whispering or shouting psalms. It's both tragic and strangely noble, a reminder that even in the most lopsided battles, faith was a weapon of its own, though not always one that turned the tide. The contrast is sharp raiders relying on muscle and strategy, villagers on prayer and desperation. And yet in the middle of it all, there's an undeniable human drama. A father shielding his daughter with his own body. A young boy hurling a stone at a helmeted warrior, an act both foolish and brave. These are moments history rarely records, but they are as real as the grander tales. Because while the chronicles talk about spoils and losses, the actual fight was made up of tiny, messy acts of resistance, each one swallowed by the larger tide. By the time the defenders are beaten back, the outcome is no longer in question. Their tools lie broken in the dirt, their shouts drowned out by the victorious cries of the raiders. What began as a desperate stand has become a grim lesson. Courage without arms is no match for iron and training. And as the villagers stagger away, bloodied or bound, the realization sinks in. This wasn't a battle. It was a demonstration of power, and the village has just learned where it stands in the order of things. If the clash of steel is the thunder, then what follows is the lightning strike that sears everything it touches. Once the defenders crumble, the raiders move like men who have rehearsed this dozens of times before, because they have. They fan out, splitting into groups with eerie efficiency. One group drives livestock toward the shore, prodding cows, sheep, and pigs as if herding them onto some invisible ledger. Another heads straight for the longhouses, their eyes scanning for chests, coins, or anything that gleams. A third storms into the church, where holy relics and decorated manuscripts lie waiting, their gold leaf shimmering even in the smoke-darkened light. You might think pillaging looks chaotic, but in truth, it's structured greed. Each warrior knows what has value and what doesn't. Iron tools, silver chalices, bolts of dyed cloth, these vanish into sacks and packs with startling speed. If a villager drops to their knees begging, the plea is ignored as thoroughly as a buzzing fly. The focus is singular. Take everything worth taking. And in that process, mercy is just another word for inefficiency. The livestock alone are treasures. In an age where cattle are as good as currency, driving away a dozen cows is like raiding a bank. Sheep provide wool, pigs provide meat, and goats provide milk and hide. To you, it might feel like watching someone strip a house of appliances and cash all at once. To the villagers, it's even worse. It's watching their very survival for winter march away under foreign hands. And then there are the treasures of faith. In monasteries where monks had spent lifetimes crafting illuminated manuscripts, pages glowing with careful inks, the raiders flipped through them only long enough to tear off a jewel-encrusted cover or rip out gilded pages. To the Norsemen, the words themselves are meaningless. The artistry that took decades is reduced to scraps, its value measured only in how much silver can be melted out of the bindings. Imagine someone smashing a priceless violin just to pry the strings loose for resale. That's the level of disregard at play. Of course, the plundering isn't just about objects. The raiders ransack pantries, seizing salted fish, dried grains, and barrels of ale. Supplies meant to last a community through the winter are carried to the ships in armfuls. For the villagers who survive, hunger will come long after the raiders have gone. The blow isn't only immediate, it's delayed a wound that festers in the months to follow. Here's a thought for you: have you ever had something stolen that wasn't just valuable, but personal? Maybe a family heirloom, maybe a laptop with years of memories. The sting isn't only the loss of the object, it's the violation, the knowledge that someone rifled through your life and decided what was worth keeping. That's what this plundering feels like on a communal scale. Every object ripped from a shelf or chest is a reminder that nothing is sacred when greed is the only compass. The raiders know speed is essential. The longer they linger, the greater the chance for reinforcements to arrive from a neighboring town. So the pillaging is rapid, a blur of hands, grabbing feet, stomping doors, splintering. The village is less a battlefield now than a marketplace turned upside down, except the customers aren't paying, and the shopkeepers are tied up in the dirt. And yet through it all, there's almost a grim humor in the precision of it. You can imagine one warrior stuffing his pouch with chalices only to stop and casually sip ale straight from a barrel before kicking it over. Another snatches a cloak dyed a deep crimson, swirling it over his shoulders as though mocking the village elders who once wore it with pride. It's greed, yes, but it's also performance, the deliberate flaunting of power. By the time the first sacks are dragged toward the ships, the village looks unrecognizable. Longhouses, gutted sacred spaces, violated animals driven off. What isn't taken is trampled. And the people left standing, those not bound or dragged along, are frozen in disbelief. Their world hasn't just been looted, it's been humiliated. The message is unmistakable. Nothing you own, nothing you trust, nothing you build is safe. The fire might take your house, the raiders might take your cattle, but when they stride into the church, it feels like they've stolen something deeper, your very anchor in the world. And here's the hook: faith itself isn't safe. For centuries, villagers had looked to the church as a sanctuary, a place beyond the reach of worldly violence. But when the doors are smashed from their hinges and armored men pour inside, that illusion collapses in a single echoing crash. Imagine the scene inside a monastery. Monks, startled from their chants, scatter like startled birds, robes flapping, as they clutch manuscripts to their chests. Candles topple wax, spilling across stone floors as raiders stomp toward the altar. The golden cross that has gleamed in the morning light for years is wrenched from its pedestal in seconds. Sacred chalices, carefully blessed, are stuffed into sacks with as little reverence as one might give a stolen loaf of bread. To the Norseman, it's not holy, it's shiny portable wealth. The labor of decades, the prayers of generations reduced to coinage for markets abroad. And yet this isn't only about greed. There's a message in it too, one that villagers can't mistake. The raiders aren't just saying, "We can take your things." They're saying, "Even your God can't protect you." That desecration cuts deeper than any blade. If the holiest place isn't safe, what is? If the house of God can be stripped bare, where can you hide? Fear takes root, not just in bodies, but in souls. Think about how we feel today when a natural disaster destroys a school or a place of worship. The grief isn't only for the loss of bricks and beams, but for the loss of certainty, the sense that some spaces should remain untouchable. Now imagine that loss not caused by storm or accident, but by human hands deliberately mocking what you hold sacred. That's what it felt like to watch raiders pry gemstones from holy books, or laugh as they toppled reliquaries. Some chronicles describe monks standing their ground, clutching crosses, or chanting prayers, even as raiders advanced. Their resistance wasn't physical, but spiritual, a refusal to bow in silence. And yet, history tells us how that ended. Prayers cut short, voices, silenced, manuscripts torn apart. The chronicles that survive are often written by the few who escaped, dripping with grief, as they recount the heathens trampling the most sacred ground. Whether you share their faith or not, you can feel the weight of their despair in every word. It wasn't only churches that suffered. Wayside shrines, relic chests, even cemeteries could be disturbed. Raiders stripped metal from coffins, pried offerings from graves. What had been left for the dead was carried off to feed the living somewhere else. It was a violation of more than property. It was a violation of memory, of the thin veil between the present and the eternal. And for medieval people, that breach was unthinkable. And yet, here's where the story gets more complicated. Not all raiders were blind to Christianity. Some had already encountered it, even been baptized, either as a political move or a survival tactic. But in the heat of a raid, faith didn't matter. A church was a treasure chest, plain and simple. The irony, of course, is that in later centuries, Scandinavia would adopt Christianity, fully building its own churches on the wealth taken from others. That twist of history doesn't ease the pain of those early centuries, though. For the villagers who watched their altar smashed, it felt like the end of the world. So when the raiders finally storm back out of the church, sacks bulging, the sight is almost worse than fire. They've not only stolen bread, silver, and livestock, they've stolen certainty. The villagers are left staring at shattered doors and broken icons, realizing that their last refuge has been stripped bare. The smoke still rises outside, but in their hearts, something darker settles. If faith itself cannot shelter them, what can you hear at first as a high-pitched wail? Not the deep shouts of men, but the piercing cries of children. The raiders know exactly what they're doing. While silver and cattle fill their pockets, people fill their future profits. And families are the easiest source of that wealth. Women are pulled from doorways, their wrists tied roughly with ropes. Children, too small to fight back, are grabbed under the arm like sacks of grain carried toward the waiting ships. To the villagers, it's a horror beyond words. To the raiders, it's simply another form of cargo. Picture a mother clinging to her daughter, her nails digging into her child's arm, as if sheer grip could hold back fate. A warrior pries her fingers loose one by one, ignoring her screams as the girl is yanked away. An elderly grandmother, too frail to resist, falls to her knees in the dirt as her grandsons are herded toward the beach. These aren't just captives. They are future's erased households shattered in real time. If you've ever misplaced a child in a crowded marketplace and felt that cold spike of panic before finding them again, you can imagine the feeling. But here, there is no reunion. And the cruelty isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, calculated. Raiders know that capturing women and children ensures obedience from the rest. A father, who might otherwise grab a pitchfork, lowers it when he sees a blade held near his son's neck. Resistance evaporates when family becomes leverage. It's a harsh kind of strategy, one that doesn't require words to make its point fight, and you'll lose more than your freedom. The ships become pens for human lives. Captives are herded down the shore, stumbling barefoot over stones and driftwood wrists bound behind them. The raiders bark orders, pushing them into groups, sorting them by age, strength, and value. A strong young man is shoved into one cluster, a woman of childbearing age into another, children into yet another. It's an inventory written not on parchment, but on human bodies. And all the while, the villagers who remain free are paralyzed with helplessness, watching their community being divided like livestock. What makes this even crueler is how quick it happens. A raid might last only a few hours from the first sight of sails to the last sack carried aboard. In that span, a family that had breakfast together in peace is scattered forever. Fathers separated from sons, sisters torn from brothers, parents forced to choose between running for safety or staying to clutch at the ones already taken. Imagine your own family photo album, faces smiling together, and then imagine someone ripping it apart, scattering the pieces across oceans. That's what this looked like, only it wasn't paper being torn. Chronicles from Ireland and Francia describe this in tones of grief that still sting centuries later. One monk wrote of raiders sweeping the lambs of Christ into their nets, a chilling phrase that shows how even children were seen as prey. These accounts weren't exaggerations meant to stir pity. They were the lived experience of entire communities watching the young and vulnerable carried off, knowing they might never hear their voices again. And yet, there's another layer of irony. Some of those taken would in time become woven into the societies of their captors. A child carried away to Scandinavia might grow up speaking Norse, forgetting their birthplace entirely. Some women taken as captives eventually bore children in distant lands, their bloodlines flowing into the very culture that had destroyed their homes. History is full of those contradictions, where tragedy births a strange, unwanted legacy. But in the moment, none of that matters. The villagers watching see only absence, the hole left behind, where once stood laughter, routine, and family. The sound of the sea is drowned out by sobs, the crash of waves, by the crunch of bound feet stumbling into ships. The raiders don't pause to explain or to justify. To them, this is business. To the villagers, it is heartbreak written in real time. When the shouting fades, and the last of the raiders vanish toward the beach, what remains behind is almost worse than the chaos itself. The firestorm aftermath smolders across the village like a grim painting. Smoke curls upward in thick black columns, blotting out the morning sky. Thatched roofs, once golden in the sun, collapse inward with a hiss, sending sparks leaping into the air. The smell is overwhelming. Scorched wood-singed wool. The acrid sting of grain stores burned before they could be harvested. You step through the dirt lanes, and your sandals crunch on shards of pottery splintered beams and the faint outline of what used to be home. It's the silence that unsettles most. Moments ago, everything was noise, shouts, steel fire. Now, there's only the distant crackle of embers and the muffled sobs of those who remain. A woman kneels in the ashes of her longhouse, her hands black with soot, as she digs frantically for anything left unburned. A farmer stares blankly at the empty pen where his oxen once stood, as if willing them to reappear. These are not dramatic gestures for the sake of history. They're small, quiet acts of despair, the kind that never make it into chronicles, but linger in memory for lifetime. You might wonder, why didn't more villages build stone walls or forts to protect themselves? The answer lies all around you in the rubble. Walls take wealth, labor, and time. Most communities lived day to day, their lives centered on crops, not castles. And so they built with wood and thatch materials that fed the soil but betrayed them to fire. What seemed practical in peace became fatal in war. Imagine if all the houses in your neighborhood were made of cardboard. One spark would spell disaster, and there'd be little point in fireproof locks if the whole block was already aflame. And then there's the human wreckage. Survivors huddled together in clumps, some rocking back and forth, others staring blankly into the smoke. A child cries for a brother who will never return. An old man coughs until his chest rattles the smoke, having carved its way deep into his lungs. These aren't battle wounds, in the glorious sense no shining swords or banners. They're the scars of ordinary people caught in extraordinary violent scars that bleed into the next generation's stories. Chronicles describe entire regions laid waste. But what they don't capture is the sound of grief rising from a single burned hut, or the way neighbors avoid each other's eyes because they share the same unspoken thought. Why them, and not me survivors, often carry guilt heavier than any sack of stolen treasure. They lived, but at the cost of someone else's absence. And that absence echoes louder in the quiet than the raiders ever did in the attack. If you've ever walked through the aftermath of a natural disaster, a town flattened by a tornado, a neighborhood gutted by wildfire, you've seen something similar. People wander in disbelief, picking through rubble for scraps of their old life, a half-melted spoon, a charred toy, a photograph singed at the edges. Those objects suddenly mean more than gold, because they're proof of continuity, fragments of a world that once made sense. Medieval villagers did the same, pulling cracked icons or scorched tools from the debris, clinging to them like lifelines. And yet, even amid the devastation, survival instincts spark. Someone calls for water to douse smoldering beams. Another insists on counting who remains, tallying the living against the dead and the captured. The community, though broken, begins the slow, painful process of acknowledging reality. They are fewer, now poorer, but still breathing. Smoke may sting their eyes, but the simple act of gathering together is the first step in resisting despair. The raiders are gone, their ship slipping back across the horizon. but their shadow lingers carved into every blackened post and every sob that refuses to quiet. What you see around you isn't just ruin. It's a warning, written in ash one, that neighboring villages will hear long before the smoke clears. And for those who survived this day, life will never divide neatly into before and after again. It will always be smoke, always be silence, always be the knowledge that once, on an ordinary morning, the world collapsed into fire. The clatter of chains and the shuffle of bound feet tell you everything has changed. The raiders are no longer running, no longer striking. They are organizing, corralling, herding. What was once a village is now a column of captives, wrists tied, shoulders, slumped eyes fixed on the ground. The march toward the ships feels less like a walk and more like being pulled into another world, each step dragging people further from the lives they knew. Down at the beach, the longships loom larger than ever. Their carved dragon heads glare at the captives as if mocking them, and the dark yawning holds gape open, like the throats of beasts ready to swallow. The smell is harsh here, tar seaweed sweat, and the sharp sting of fear. Children cry as they're shoved into lines, women clutch each other for balance, and men try to keep their dignity even as ropes bite into their wrists. To the raiders, it's not grief on display. It's inventory being moved to storage. The march itself is a kind of theater. Raiders bark orders in a language the villagers don't understand, their guttural tones punctuated by laughter. One swings his spear, idly using the butt to prod a captive who stumbles too slowly. Another adjusts the ropes on a group of young men, tightening knots with the same practiced rhythm a farmer might use to tie livestock. The message is unmistakable. You're no longer people, you're property, and your value will be measured later. Have you ever stood in an airport security line hemmed in by barriers forced to move forward at the pace of those ahead of you? That sense of powerlessness, of being treated as part of a faceless crowd, is only a faint echo of this. Here, there's no ticket waiting at the end, only a ship that will sail you away from everything familiar. Some resist even now. A mother digs her heels into the sand, refusing to step closer to the water. She's dragged forward by two raiders, her screams hoarse, her child wrenched from her arms and carried separately. An old man collapses to his knees, his legs unable to carry him further. He receives a blow for his trouble, not enough to kill him, just enough to remind him that his body is not his own. These small acts of defiance don't change the outcome, but they show something deeper even when all else is stolen. The instinct to resist survives, however briefly. The villagers who remain behind those not taken watch this grim procession with hollow faces. They stand among the smoking ruins, powerless to intervene their eyes, following the bound figures as if memorizing them for the last time. No one says it aloud, but everyone knows the truth. Most who board those ships will never see this shore again. It's a farewell, without words, a severing, written in sand and rope. And so the column moves step by heavy step until the last captive is shoved into place. The raiders secure their human cargo with the same precision they showed when stealing livestock or treasure. The difference is that treasure doesn't sob and cattle don't plead. But to the men tightening the ropes, those sounds are no more distracting than gulls crying overhead. The business of plunder is nearly complete, and the sea is ready to carry its burden away. Once the captives are pushed aboard, the longships begin to shift and groan as if alive their hulls, rocking against the waves. You step into the hold, and the first thing that strikes you is the closeness of it. The air is heavy with tar sweat and seawater, and already it feels hard to breathe. The benches that once held oarsmen now double as rough platforms, where prisoners are forced to sit shoulder-pressed to shoulder ropes digging into their wrists. There's no room to stretch, no privacy, just the endless sway of the sea and the creak of wood above your head. The crossing is not a voyage of discovery, it's a punishment in motion. Waves slam against the sides, sending cold spray into the faces of those crammed along the planks. Food is scarce, often nothing more than a chunk of dried fish or a swallow of brackish water. Some captives refuse to eat altogether, their grief heavier than hunger. Others clutch at their children, trying to shield them from the constant jostling, though there's little comfort to be given. Every shift of the boat reminds you that your fate now lies far from anything you've ever known. Illness spreads easily in such confinement. A cough in the morning becomes a chorus by nightfall, and with no medicine or mercy, the sick are left slumped in their places. The smell grows worse by the hour, a sour blend of salt sickness and despair. If you've ever been trapped in a crowded train car on a hot summer day, surrounded by strangers, pressed too close, you've felt a whisper of this suffocation. Now strip away the chance of stepping off at the next stop, and you begin to understand. Above, the raiders move freely, shouting to one another as they adjust sails or take turns at the oars. Their voices filter down like reminders of who holds power here. Sometimes, laughter drifts into the hold, mocking in its carelessness. A man below coughs until he shakes, and the laughter above grows louder, as if the suffering below is entertainment. The contrast is cruel freedom stride across the deck, captivity stewing in the dark. The sea itself joins the torment. Storms roll across the horizon without warning, tossing the ship so violently that captives slide against one another, bruising skin against wood and rope. Lightning cracks above thunder, booming so loud it rattles your teeth. Some captives cry out to God, others sit silent, too numb to speak. The raiders harden to the sea shout and adjust sails as if it's just another day. To them, the storm is a challenge. To you, it feels like judgment. But even in such misery, moments of grim clarity emerge. You notice how the captives huddle together, whispering in low voices when the guards aren't listening. They share scraps of comfort, even bits of food, helping children to sip water or urging the despondent to hold on a little longer. The bonds of community, though torn from the village, weave themselves again in the darkness of the ship's belly. Hope becomes fragile, but it doesn't vanish entirely. The horizon remains unseen, the days uncountable as the long ship cleaves through waves toward some distant shore. Time on board becomes a blur. Hunger, sickness, exhaustion, punctuated by the crash of water and the bark of orders. You know you're leaving behind everything familiar. The language of your prayers, the smell of your fields, the sound of your village bells, and heading into a future that offers no promises but plenty of chains. When the coastline finally does appear, it's almost shocking in its normality. Hills, trees, harbors, towns, all so familiar and yet so foreign. For the raiders, it means markets and profit. For the captives, it means the end of the sea, but not the end of suffering. Because the next stage of this journey is waiting at the docks, and it won't be kinder than the one you've just endured. The shoreline you finally glimpse isn't salvation. it's the beginning of a new nightmare. As the ships scrape against foreign docks, the raiders bark orders and drive the captives out into the blinding light. After days in the dank belly of the vessel, the sun stings your eyes. The air feels raw against your skin, and the solid ground beneath your feet makes your legs wobble. But there's no pause to savor the end of the voyage. The march begins, immediately ropes tugging at wrists as you're herded like cattle toward the heart of a market square. The sound is the first shock. Crowds gather to see the newcomers, curious onlookers pressing in from all sides. Traders, townsfolk, and lords' representatives appraise you with eyes that don't linger on faces, but on bodies. Broad shoulders, strong arms, clear-skinned youth. Each detail becomes a calculation of value. A boy of 12 is prodded and spun around like a horse at auction. A woman has her chin lifted, her teeth inspected as though she were livestock. It's not hatred in their eyes. It's commerce, and somehow that indifference cuts deeper than cruelty. The marketplace smells of spices, fish, and sweat, and the noise rises like a tide haggling laughter, the clink of coins. For those who once lived freely, this is disorientation at its peak. You're no longer a neighbor or kin. You're an item on a list, an asset waiting to be exchanged. If you've ever walked through a modern flea market or antique fair and watched strangers haggle over objects that once belonged to someone else, you've seen a faint echo of this scene. The difference, of course, is that here the objects are breathing. The raiders play their roles with practiced ease. They boast loudly about the strength of their captives, yanking arms upward to show muscle-shoving prisoners forward to demonstrate obedience. Their goal isn't subtlety, it's spectacle. The louder they claim value, the higher the bids climb. Buyers murmur in Latin Old Norse or Frankish tongues, discussing prices as if trading bolts of cloth. You hear numbers tossed about, coins clinking into hands, and each sound marks another life severed from its past. For the captives, humiliation is layered upon fear. Some stand silent, trying not to draw attention. Others cry openly, their grief washing over the square, but ignored by the crowd. Parents cling to children until they're pried apart, their arms dragged back as bids are closed. It's not violence in the battlefield sense. It's violence of transaction, the slow tearing of identity into pieces marked by silver weights. And then there's the spectacle, for those who aren't buying. Townsfolk lean in to watch, not unlike crowds today that gather around a street performance or a car accident. Curiosity turns people into spectators of misery, and for the captives, every stare feels like another blow. You realize in this moment that anonymity is gone. Even grief is on display. Some chronicles describe these scenes with cold precision. At markets in Dublin, York, or Hedeby, captives were paraded before buyers who checked their health, questioned their origins, and bid accordingly. Strong laborers fetched high prices for farms and docks. Skilled women could be traded into households or weaving halls. Children with years of labor ahead were considered investments. The cruelty was wrapped in economic logic, as if breaking apart families and communities were simply part of trade. And yet, even in this humiliation, you sense fragments of resistance. Captives exchange glances, whisper fragments of prayers, or grip each other's hands until forced apart. It's not enough to change the outcome, but it's enough to remind you that identity lingers, however battered. The raiders can strip possessions, sell bodies, divide families, but they can't fully erase the memory of where you came from, at least not in this moment. By the time the square empties, coins have changed hands, and the captives are gone absorbed into the lives of strangers. The raiders count their earnings, laughing and drinking, as though the day has been no more than a successful hunt. For them, the work is done. For the captives, the work of survival is only beginning, and it will stretch across years, perhaps lifetimes in places far from the home they'll never see again. The auction block may have ended the raid, but for the captives, life as spoils is just beginning. Once the coins exchange hands, you are no longer a villager, no longer a son, daughter, or parent. You are property folded into the rhythms of a household that doesn't speak your language or care about your grief. Some are led into sprawling farms where dawn begins with the crack of a whip or the barked command of an overseer. Others are absorbed into urban households, set to work spinning wool, grinding grain, or carrying water. For the unlucky, life means rowing benches or heavy chains, back bent under the burden of endless labor. Daily existence becomes a careful dance between survival and obedience. Meals are meager scraps of barley bread or fish stew ladled into bowls, just enough to keep muscles moving. Sleep comes on hard floors, often broken by nightmares of the village left behind. You find yourself listening, constantly attuned to the moods of those who now command you. A single mistake, spilled milk, a broken tool can draw a blow, or worse. If you've ever worked a job where the boss watched your every move, you know the tension. Now imagine that your freedom, your safety, even your family depend on keeping that boss satisfied. And yet, life as spoils is not uniform. Some captives, particularly skilled ones, blacksmiths, carpenters, or weavers, are treated as valuable assets, given slightly better food, perhaps even a measure of trust. Others, too young or too weak, are treated as expendable, shuffled from one task to the next until they break. Children often adapt fastest, learning the language, mimicking the customs, slowly becoming part of a culture they never chose. Adults cling harder to memory, refusing to let their old lives be erased. That difference often determines who endures and who collapses under the weight of despair. Stories ripple through the years of captives who managed to climb within these new worlds. Some were absorbed into the households of chieftains, becoming trusted attendants. A few even bore children who inherited their father's wealth, their own roots buried beneath new branches. It's a cruel irony that some of the very bloodlines of future Norse rulers may have carried within them the descendants of those villages once raided and burned. The legacy of being spoils sometimes meant not just loss, but transformation. But such outcomes are rare. For most, the new life is one of endless toil. Fields stretch wide under foreign suns, your hands blistering as you dig, plant, and harvest crops that will never fill your own family's bowls. Markets buzz with chatter you don't understand, while you stand to the side carrying baskets until your back aches. Every face around you is strange, every word unfamiliar, and in that strangeness lies a deep loneliness. You're surrounded by people, yet utterly alone. And yet, in quiet moments, you sense small acts of defiance. A lullaby whispered in your native tongue, though the child listening no longer remembers its meaning. A secret carving etched into a piece of wood, marking initials of a home long gone. A prayer whispered silently, trusting that the God of your village still hears across oceans. These aren't rebellions that topple masters, but they are rebellions of the spirit, refusals to let identity be completely erased. If you've ever carried a keepsake from childhood, a faded photo, a worn-out toy, you know how powerful small symbols can be in keeping memory alive. For captives, living as spoils, memory itself becomes resistance. The raiders may own your labor, but they cannot fully command your heart. Still, reality presses in daily. You rise at dawn, you work until dusk, and you collapse into sleep only to wake and do it again. There is no promise of return, no certainty of reunion. The life you once lived has become a story told only inside your own head. And as the seasons pass, you realize that survival isn't just about enduring the labor. It's about keeping that story alive, even when the world around you insists you've been reduced to nothing more than spoils of war. For all the weight of chains and the years of silent resistance never disappears completely. It doesn't always look like swords clashing or fires burning. It often starts as whispers, as sideways glances, as secret vows made under the cover of night. Survivors who remain in the villages, scarred but unbroken, carry rage like an ember, waiting for the right breath of wind to ignite it. Around smoky hearths, elders recount the raids in trembling voices, not just to grieve but to teach. Remember what they did, and be ready when they come again. Whispers of vengeance spread along trade routes just as quickly as rumors of raids once did. In Francia, lords begin to gather militias, building wooden fortifications along riverbanks. In England, kings levy new taxes not for feasts, but for defenses, a grim innovation that will one day be known as Donegeld money, meant to buy peace from raiders. These measures are born from pain, a recognition that turning blind eye only invites more fire. The survivors' stories become fuel for strategies, their wounds transformed into warnings etched into policy. But resistance isn't always about kings and armies. Sometimes it's personal, even petty. A farmer once captive and escaped spreads knowledge of raider tactics, how they strike at dawn, how they split into groups, how they prize speed over siege. A monk spared by luck begins copying not just scripture, but accounts of raids, ensuring memory outlives the men who wielded axes. Even a child once dragged toward a ship and miraculously freed grows into an adult who teaches the next generation to watch the horizon more carefully. These small acts accumulate, weaving a net of resilience across lands scarred by fire. Think of how communities today respond after disasters. Floods prompt levees. Earthquakes inspire stricter building codes. Pandemics create new systems of health. Medieval villages lacking blueprints and engineers adapted in their own ways. Churches built watchtowers. Settlements shifted slightly inland. Neighbors began storing goods in hidden pits ready to be buried at the first sight of sales. The cost of vigilance was high, but the cost of ignorance had already been higher. Yet rebellion took larger forms too. As decades rolled forward, raids sometimes met real resistance. Chronicles tell of towns that banded together, fighting not with desperation alone, but with preparation. On occasion, they even won. A Viking leader cut down a longship, captured a raid driven back into the sea. Each of these victories, small on their own, stitched together a new narrative: the raiders were not invincible. But the most enduring resistance was cultural. The scars of raids bled into stories, songs, and prayers. Bards sang of villages that endured, of martyrs who stood firm, of communities rebuilt stronger than before. These stories carried defiance across generations, teaching children not just to fear the dragon-proud ships, but to despise them, to resist their allure, and to shape lives around the memory of survival. The Vikings may have stolen gold and people, but they could never fully control the tales told about them. There's irony in it, isn't there? The same fear that once froze villagers in place eventually hardened into a collective backbone. What began as scattered families fleeing into the woods transformed into kingdoms, reorganizing their armies, fortifying coasts, and recording every atrocity in ink and parchment. The raiders may have sparked terror in the moment, but in the long run, they also sparked unity. Communities that might never have looked to each other for aid began to link arms against a common enemy. And so resistance became both loud and quiet in the clang of reforged weapons, in the building of wooden palisades, in the whispered bedtime warnings to children never to trust the horizon. The survivors of raids carried scars, but they also carried a strange inheritance, the determination that the firestorm would not happen again, at least not without a fight. Generations later, the scars of the raids still linger. You can almost hear them in the way stories are told at the hearth, in the prayers whispered in dim chapels, in the songs that carry both grief and warning. The legacy of terror doesn't fade when the ships sail away. It seeps into the soil, into the rhythm of daily life, into the very identity of the people who survived. Children grow up knowing to glance at the horizon with suspicion, not because they remember the raids themselves, but because their parents and grandparents told them never to forget. The chronicles preserved by monks capture this legacy with mournful precision. They write of heathen men descending like locusts of villages, left smoking of churches stripped bare. To modern ears, the language sounds exaggerated, but for those who lived through it, no exaggeration was needed. The sight of dragon-proud ships gliding up rivers was more terrifying than any demon inked into the margins of their manuscripts. Fear was not symbolic. It was memory etched into skin and psyche. But legacy isn't only fear. Out of trauma came transformation. Kingdoms that once bickered among themselves began forging alliances, pooling strength against a common enemy. Fortresses rose along riverside stone replacing timber, as if to prove that memory had become muscle. Even trade shifted, rerouted in ways meant to outwit the raiders. The very fabric of medieval Europe was rewoven in response to the long shadow of the Viking threat. In a grim way, the raiders forced their enemies to grow sharper, stronger, more vigilant. Still, the stories of individual suffering never vanish beneath those grander changes. A mother who lost her child to a longship is remembered in a family line that repeats her name for generations. A village burned to the ground is rebuilt, but its layout changes with houses clustered tighter for defense, as if the very architecture remembers. Even songs carry echoes, lullabies that began as laments, chants that remind children to stay near home when the gulls grow quiet. The past is not buried, it's repurposed, a warning stitched into culture itself. Think about your own community today. How often do neighborhoods still tell the tales of storms, fires, or wars long past? This street flooded 10 years ago. That hill was once a battlefield. Memory lingers in landscapes shaping how people live even after the immediate danger is gone. The Viking raids left the same kind of footprint, a reminder that terror doesn't just burn villages, it reshapes generations. And the irony is that while the raiders thought only of silver livestock and captives, their true legacy was unintended. They became the villains in stories that outlived them, the monsters in children's nightmares, the cautionary figures in sermons. Every stolen chalice, every burned hut, every bound captive became another thread in the vast tapestry of history that painted the Vikings not only as warriors, but as harbingers of dread. In trying to seize wealth, They secured infamy. So when you imagine the brutal reality of Viking raids, don't stop at the fire and the steel. Imagine the silence afterward, the rebuilding, the telling and retelling of what happened. That silence is the loudest legacy of all, because it carried forward through centuries, shaping identities long after the dragon ships rotted away. For the villagers who lived and those who remembered the raids never truly ended. They became part of the world's